Hello, this is my first in a series of videos on different genres of guitar music in the 20th century. I am here with my guitar professor, Dr. Brent McPike, and he is going to be discussing with me some of the classical guitar traditions of the 20th century. So, who would you say were some of the most prominent guitar players in terms of classical music in the 20th century?
Well, first and foremost, you'd have to say Andres Segovia. He was born in 1893 in Andalusia, the southern part of Spain. And at the very beginning of the 20th century, the last decade, Francisco Tárrega, the father of the modern classical guitar, was still alive. So he was at the end of his times at the very beginning of the 20th century. And he was pretty much the hero of Segovia and Segovia's older friends who had studied with Tárrega. Francisco Tárrega, by the beginning of the century, at the end of the 19th century, he had adopted a larger guitar made by Torres, Torres, a famous luthier who expanded the size of the guitar. And by the beginning of the 20th century, it had taken over as the main model of classical guitarists used. And Spain was where that guitar was designed. And during Segovia was young. He was about 16 in 1909 when he gave his first classical guitar concert in public. It was not a paid gig yet, but he was into discovering the old music of the classical guitarists from a century before, Fernando Sor, Dionisio Aguado, who were both from Spain. Aguado was from Madrid, Sor originally from Barcelona, but after a civil war, he found himself having to stay in France. And but those were two of his heroes, Sor and Aguado, as well as Giuliani over in Vienna, contemporary of Beethoven. But Segovia met up with some students of Tárrega, and especially Miguel Jobet. I say Jobet, that's how my Argentine teacher pronounced the double L in Spanish, spelled L-L-O-B-E-T, if you're looking at it from the English perspective, double L-O-B-E-T, Miguel Jobet. He was probably, to our best of our knowledge, the first guitarist to do a recording with a microphone.
Okay.
In the 1920s.
Okay.
And I'm not sure exactly what year, but he was a student of Tárrega who modernized the classical guitar, standardized, grab that footstool if you would. Tárrega standardized the use of a footstool to put under your left leg so that you could hold a guitar up in a very accessible way where both arms could have equal access, left and right hand. And he also incorporated increasing use of the ring finger, Tárrega did. Kind of standardized the use of the rest stroke, taught it the rest stroke in a systematic way. Jobet and Segovia adopted this, and in the early 20th century, those two were probably, I would say, two of the pillars in the first half of the 20th century, along with a guitarist named Sainz de la Maza. That's his last name, S-A-I-N-Z, de la Maza. He was also a very important virtuoso for whom the famous Aranjuez concerto was written by Joaquin Rodrigo, who was an important composer of all instruments, including guitar and guitar concertos, concerti. So pardon me if I switch back and forth from English to Italian. But anyway, Yeah. So does that answer your question about who were the
Yeah.
main figures in the
Yeah.
first half? So I'll mention the first half recap: Segovia, Jobert, Jobert's friend, and another student of Pujol, of Tárrega was Pujol, Pujol, and Sainz de la Masa. I would say those were probably four of the most important players. And I think most classical guitarists would agree that in the first half of the 20th century. You also had Héctor Villa-Lobos, the Brazilian,
Mm-hmm.
who was a street musician in his youth, played in choro bands, he played guitar, he played cello, he played a lot of instruments. He was huge to the building of the repertoire of the guitar, more in terms of quality than in terms of quantity. He wrote several works for guitar, a set of 12 etudes for Segovia, whom he met in Paris in the 1920s. He wrote Suite Populaire in 1908. He wrote 5 preludes for guitar in the early 40s, while World War II was going on, and Villa-Lobos was composing the preludes. During the World Wars, there was a lot of guitar activity for the classical guitar in Buenos Aires, Argentina. I'd say 3 of the main cities for classical, what we think of as traditional classical guitar: Buenos Aires, Argentina, and South America. In Mexico City was a huge area of the guitar's development in terms of fine performers and the cultivation of the literature and practice. And up here, New York, LA, Washington, D.C. Were big centers for guitars. Segovia toured all over the country. He went to Australia. He called himself, in fact, the apostle of the guitar. No high opinion of himself there. Anyway, there's some interesting documentaries on video about Andres Segovia. And so in the second half of the 20th century, Segovia remained important. He lived a long life. He lived until he was 94 years old. I saw Segovia perform when I was just a couple months shy of my 20th birthday in the spring of 1986. I saw Segovia perform a concert. He was 93 years old in 1986, and I saw him play in Chicago. So, and he gave many master classes. He was a dynamo. he was always at it. He didn't compose much. He wrote a couple studies, a short piece or two, but he was big into transcribing works of other great composers, Baroque and classical era, Romantic era composers, from Beethoven to Grieg to, you name it. He composed, transcribed a lot of music, as did Tárrega, who I mentioned before. Tárrega, those guys in the early 20th century, those guitarists, and a woman too, Maria Luisa Anido. I can't forget her, because she was a student of Segovia and Miguel Jobert, and she even did a recording in the 20s with Miguel Jobert. She was probably the most renowned female guitarist in the early 20th century. She was from Buenos Aires, and she taught my teacher's teacher, actually. Anyway, and then in the later 20th century, you had the Romero's family, who moved over to California from Malaga, Spain. You had the father, Celdonio, his sons, Celine, Pepe, and Angel, the famous Romero's guitar quartet, and Christopher Parking. And then some of the guys that became really popular in the later 20th century: Manuel Barrueco, David Russell, Ernesto Viteri, my teacher. And as far as composers in the later 20th century, Leo Brouwer was huge. So there's so many names I could go on. So I don't know how long you want me to go on. I could talk your ears all the way off.
So my next question is going to be, how does 20th century classical guitar music differ from what came before it?
Okay, that's a good question. Well, there was what came before it in terms of classical guitar. If we go back to the Baroque era, the guitar was smaller in the Baroque. In fact, here is a. That's interesting. This guitar was not a lot bigger. These guitars from the Baroque era were 10 strings, 5 courses. So when you think of courses, think of groups of strings. For example, a 12-string guitar is 6 courses of double strings. So therefore, it's 6 doubles is 12. So 12-string guitar. These had 5 courses, double string. So 10 strings in total, but you had 2 high E's, 2 B's, 2 G's, 2 D's, and 2 low A's. And in the Baroque era, there was no low 6th string. You would get that from some other instrument, like a viola da gamba or a cello or something like that during the Baroque era. And then in they added a string around 1800, late 1790s, or sometime between 1780. The first music written for 6 strings in standard notation was about 1798, Boccherini. That in the years just after they added a 6 string at the end of the 18th century. But now around the first quarter of the 19th century, 1800 to 1825, the guitar became hugely popular with Fernando Sor, Aguado, Giuliani. A lot of great music was written. And then, like I said, later, the guitar was kind of small. It was more in parlors and small entertainment circles.
Right. Kind of like a parlor piano.
A parlor piano.
Yeah.
But once that Torres made that bigger guitar I mentioned earlier, people like Tárrega and Jobet transcribing big classical works for the larger sounding guitar, it planted the idea in Segovia's head that, hey, I want to take this into the bigger concert halls and be part of the Philharmonic world. Mm-hmm. And Segovia was just, like I said, he was a dynamo. And he got it by the time, right at the tail end after World War I was over, about 1918, he was practicing for these big concert halls, and by 1919 he got his first big gig at the age of 23. And the guitar became, the classical guitar became more a part of the Philharmonic world, where you sell tickets to a concert hall, and Segovia would sell them out. And that was a huge deal. You know, the pianoforte, had people like Chopin and Franz Liszt doing big concerts, but the guitar really didn't. It had still been a parlor instrument to that time. And then, it kept, as long as Segovia, his prime years were 1919, were right after World War I, clear up to the 80s. He could still play pretty well at 90, not like when he was a young pup of 70, but but anyway, that was.
Yeah. So, I guess was there a big, other than the adding of the 6th string,
Mm-hmm.
was there a big style difference in terms of
technique changed a bit. Yeah.
Technique or writing style even?
Yes. The Villa-Lobos was really instrumental in the 1920s, from the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s. Villa-Lobos, He wrote idiomatically for the instrument. He really maximized the sonorities. His preludes and etudes really milk the guitar, so to, for a lot of sound. And Segovia loved those pieces. Other composers, some of the compositional tendencies. The guitar sometimes was a little behind orchestral and chamber music and piano music in terms of style, slightly, because of its difficulty to master. It would lag a couple decades behind.
Right.
Whereas the peak of the classical movement, classical music, when we think of the classical era, you're thinking of 1790, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, a young 20-year-old Beethoven. You had a young Mozart still pouring it out. He was right before he died, but and Haydn was still composing. So 1780s and 90s, that was high classical. The high classical of the era of the guitar was more like the 1810s, a couple of decades back. As far as styles, though, one big thing, not only when Tarrega played, the guitar expanded in size, and Segovia's, he performed during World War II. He started noticing that he couldn't find strings as readily. Strings were made of sheep gut, the skin of sheep intestines. And some people called it cat gut. I don't know, whatever animal, sheep, goat, whatever they could use. That's what strings were made of. And in World War II, strings were mostly manufactured in Italy. And Italy was war-torn. The Battle of Anzio going on. They were using all that material up to sew wounded soldiers' wounds for sutures. And Segovia simply couldn't find material, and he would have to play his strings much longer. And eventually he got in touch with a luthier named Augustine in New York, and who happened to have a connection to the DuPont family, who patented nylon in 1937. And they had been using it for fishing line and things like that, and maybe sewing together boots or whatever. But Segovia and Augustine approached DuPont. DuPont and Augustine got together, and they made a prototype. And that was put on the market right after World War II. And like many other things, recording technology, radio technology, World War II changed the game in a lot of fields, including classical guitar, with innovation. You notice too, the recording, whether you're listening to classical guitar music or popular music, jazz of the day, you notice a marked improvement in sound quality 1935 compared to 1950, before the war and after the war. The sound quality vastly improved during that period. The guitar, the strings improved. The nylon was a big improvement over the gut strings, because it also caused guitarists to change their techniques slightly, to use more fingernail, because the gut was a little rougher to the touch. It wasn't a smooth and glassy surface, and it was harder to use nails. I mean, people used a little bit of nail, but it just wasn't as slick a sound. You could play beautiful tones, and and you could play fast punteado scales and stuff, and do your rasgueado strums and all that. But it really helped the smoothness and the legato style. The nylon string did. The nylon string helped smooth out the technique of guitarists, and it's between 1950 and 1990, those 40 years, the level of technical ability just rose rapidly in the classical guitar. The second half of the century just went rapidly once we started using nylon strings.
So, if you were to listen to, I'm going to use this as an example because I know it exists, a Vivaldi guitar piece
Okay.
versus something from the early 1900s. What kind of musical differences would you expect to hear?
Well, having played Vivaldi's one of his concertos in performance, and I've taught another student to play another one, so I'm familiar with a couple of his concerti that were the D major and the C major, which have been played on for violin, for mandolin, and guitar. They're pretty simple harmonically, some secondary dominants, and but they don't get real outside. In the early 20th century, when you get into Segovia's music and what they call the Segovia repertoire, a lot more mediate relationships, a lot more adventurous modulations, more programmatic works were written, kind of, almost as a nod to the Romantic style. Programmatic writers like Berlioz and Richard Strauss. Villa-Lobos, his stuff got really chromatic. He got really impressionistic. He would use planing. Listening, for instance, if you listen to Villa-Lobos Prelude No. 3, that's a great example of a piece where a 20th century composer, the piece was composed in 1940-ish, 41. But you can hear little bits of Wagner. You can hear. Oh my! You might edit that.
I will.
I have not played this in a long time. I taught it to a student maybe 6, 8, 10 years ago, and I haven't probably looked at it since. But Prelude No. 3, I hear. Oh, I've got a pick stuck in there. Yeah, you got these minor sixes resolving to perfect fifth. And the muddy range, those major third inverted is a minor six, and you'd think of later Beethoven, and when he wasn't hearing so well, writing a lot of muddy thirds in the lower range on the piano. Villa-Lobos inverted it. And then you can hear, it almost sounds Wagnerian.
Really like crunchy, and you're like waiting for it to resolve.
Yeah. And then you hear this. Then all of a sudden you have this planing stuff that is reminiscent of a Debussy. These moving half diminished or nine chords. That's an interesting prelude. It's an interesting study because you can hear Villa-Lobos kind of, and interestingly, it's an homage to Bach. But you can hear a little Wagner, you hear a little Debussy, you hear a little bit of Villa-Lobos himself. Villa-Lobos, he tried really hard to be original, and he was extremely original. He wrote these descending chromatics. He would take my middle finger's not. These descending chromatic chords using pedal tones against them. It was an E minor, and he hangs on to and utilizes these pedal tone E's while going through this descending chromatic diminished chord shape in between the outer E's.
Yeah.
To undo tension, and it's he was really innovative. He used the sonority of the guitar. He used the guitar's natural abilities. And when he wrote, it sounded like, oh yeah, this is written for guitar. Wow, this is cool. And if somebody had, and he also wrote for orchestra. And you listen to his Baquianas Brasileiras, a really original composer, but a lot of the way he thought about orchestra came from the guitar. And people thought he was a genius, and he was, because he solved problems. He used sonorities in ways they really hadn't been used much before, and he was one of them. He's probably the most, I don't know, you'd be hard, if you can find a composer from South America in the 20th century who was more prolific than Villa-Lobos, let me know who it was, because I don't know. Because I believe he wrote somewhere in the ballpark of 3,000 works. That's a huge output. So, and the guitar was only a modest percentage of it. He, like I said, he wrote maybe 4 or 5 major works or sets of works and a couple incidentals. He wrote an interesting combination for guitar called Sixtour Mystique, which I played in a chamber ensemble concert once. It had harp, guitar, celeste, clarinet, saxophone, and flute. Interesting combination of instruments. So he was an interesting composer for guitar.
Yeah. So to wrap things up,
Yeah.
Summarizing what we've talked about.
Right.
So there were a handful of really prolific or just like really important classical guitar players in the beginning of the 20th century. And a family like quartet in the later half.
The Romeros was huge. I missed one who was really, really important from Paraguay. People don't know much about Paraguay, but they had one of this little country in South America between Argentina and Brazil. They had one of the greatest ever guitarists, Agustin Barrios Mangore, who was all Mangore. Anyway, he was an extremely brilliant player and composer, and he performed his own music. So he helps reinforce the idea that South America is as important as any continent in the history of the 20th century history of the guitar. South America was huge. Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela, they had their huge traditions. So you can't talk about the history of the classical guitar in the 20th century without giving a huge nod to the continent of South America.
One of the major modifications for the guitar was nylon strings.
Yes.
And a little further back was the addition of the low E string.
Yes, back in the late 18th century.
As well as an expanded size of guitar being popularized.
In the latter part of the 19th century.
Yeah. And as far as musical differences, in terms of technique, adding the ring finger, and using more nail on your picking hand.
Yeah.
And in terms of writing and
compositional I can mention if you want to hear more about the compositional end of things. I've talked about the morphology and players, a little bit about Villa-Lobos' composition, but in the 60s the seeds were planted. Terry Riley, John Adams, Philip Glass, Steve Reich. Steve Reich, most people call him Steve Reich. He calls himself Steve Reich. He refers to it as process music. A lot of people talk about it in history classes as minimalism. But that had a place too in the 1980s in guitar music. In the late 70s and 80s, composers like Leo Brouwer and Steve Reich wrote for the guitar in what many people think of as a minimalist, or as Reich calls it process music. And Reich even got into incorporating the electric guitar as a classical instrument by this time. Whereas Brouwer wrote for the nylon string classical guitar from his native Cuba because it was so popular, like the rest of Latin America there.
And during the 20th century, we also saw bands like Yes, and
Sure.
including like classical nylon
Steve
string passages into like
Yeah.
heavy rock and pop music of the time. And I personally really like the blending of genres
Yeah.
in terms of that, because it's like one little passage could open someone's eyes to a whole different genre.
It did me. It's funny you mentioned Yes, because I read it in Guitar Player magazine as a teenager about Steve Howe taking classical guitar, and that was, I thought, wow, that sounds cool. And I didn't really know what classical guitar was. When I was a kid, 14 years old, I thought this was classical guitar. Playing with, just two fingers
Yeah.
and the Stairway to Heaven.
Yeah.
I didn't know how to do it with the classical technique at the time. And the Rush, the Trees. Rush, Yes. Even the Beatles, George Harrison on the Hard Days. You know the Beatles.
Yeah.
The little lick, the little
Yeah.
arpeggio. Even though he used it with a pick,
Yeah.
that classical guitar and the solo, the good classical guitar solo on "Till There Was You." Some of the early Beatles stuff, they were already using the nylon string. It's another color.
Yeah.
And
it definitely has a brighter, almost.
It's a full
Yeah,
sound.
it's full and it's brighter, but at the same time, it's like, at least to me, it's kind of more mellow too.
Yeah. A lot of people call it like a warm sound, whereas a steel string a brighter, crispier. But those are kind of subjective words. But we're just sticking on a 4A analysis, analyze the overtones series. But anyway, talk about the waveforms of the string of the sound wave. But anyway, yeah, the classical guitar. Paul Simon studied a little classical guitar when he was young. Good finger picker. So at that time, Segovia, the folk music movement in the '60s was happening at the same time. Segovia was like really this peak influence. He was still in his prime at age 70 in 1963 when the whole Greenwich Village folk scene was going on. You had people like Paul Simon and Bob Dylan and all these finger picking players. Joni Mitchell coming into the scene. A lot of finger picking, and with that finger picking, people wanting to learn how to play the guitar better, a lot of times would go toward, hey, let's go get a classical teacher and learn how to really finger pick. And that really caught on like wildfire. And Segovia was kind of known to be a little bit stuffy about his classical technique, and George Harrison, I can't remember the source of the story, so you might check me on this, but you may have heard it even. There's an anecdote that George Harrison was once asked during the Beatlemania years about Segovia, and he said something, oh yeah, Segovia is the granddaddy of us all, or the grandpa of everybody's grandfather, all of us. And Segovia got word of that and said something to the effect that they play electric guitar, they're not even my illegitimate children. So Segovia, I don't think he was too flattered. He didn't want to be associated with that. He spent his whole life trying to bring the guitar out of cafes and street corners and into the big concert halls, the plush seats,
Yeah.
He was on a real mission, and he had, I don't know if you'd call it a complex or what, but he was very conscientious about where the guitar was played and how. He grew up very, very modestly and had to be raised by an uncle and an aunt who, because his parents couldn't raise him. And somewhere down back in his background, a fire was burning to be somebody, and boy was he was he was, like I said, I've used the word twice at least already, dynamo. He was a juggernaut in classical guitar, Segovia. So when you talk about classical guitar in 20th century, you have to mention Segovia. He's really a big part of the reason we're sitting in this room in a university that has a guitar program. You can attribute mostly to Segovia. He was the one, he was the stalwart who got the guitar into the universities. He got honorary doctorates from several places, I think including Florida State University, among others.
Okay, so let's summarize this one more time.
Okay.
Segovia is like the man.
The main
He
promoter.
is the man of 20th century guitar music.
Yeah.
Like the face of it almost, like the poster boy.
From getting the guitar to the concert hall, nylon strings, getting the guitar in the universities, expanding the repertoire.
And then as far as comparing early guitars to 20th century guitars, it started off with adding the low E string, getting a bigger body,
Yeah, and fan bracing. That helped the sound project too.
and then nylon strings
Yeah, so were gut strings.
during World War II.
Yeah, right at the tail end of World War II.
And then technique, the use of the middle finger as well as
The ring finger more.
Yeah, the ring finger, and then using more nails.
A little bit more. That was
Yeah.
with the nylon you could use more nail.
Yeah. And then in terms of compositional styles, I guess from what you talked about, instead of being more like, uniform,
Yeah.
run-of-the-mill kind of stuff, it got more,
There was still a lot of
Yeah.
sonata form
Yeah.
in the early
But
20th century, but yeah, the minimalism, the
minimalism,
avant-garde, avant-garde. Things got
Yeah.
really dissonant and avant-garde with Leo Brouwer. In fact, on our recordings here, you could probably go find Derek Meeker's recital from a few years ago and find Leo Brouwer's 1968 work called Canticum. And you talk about out there, it's atonal. One point he tunes the E down to an E flat. But yeah, so I neglected to mention, in the 60s when the avant-garde movement was on too.
Avant-garde, minimalism, a lot of chromaticism, callbacks to Wagner, a lot more.
And there was also some sweet, ambient type music that wasn't real harmonically tense going on as well.
There was a lot more branching out that started to happen.
A lot of branching out.
Including a lot of what we see now, a lot of the genres that we see now kind of stemmed from classical guitar tradition.
Yeah, and at the end of the 20th century, as South American guitarists like Marcos Cavalcanti came to Indiana University, the great Brazilian guitarist, he was my Brazilian brother, a good friend of mine. He literally taught the state of Indiana how, even the jazz guitarists, how to play Brazilian styles like bossa nova and samba. In the Midwest, even very few jazz guitarists knew really, even in the big cities like New York and Chicago, and Indianapolis, Wes Montgomery, one of the most famous guitarists ever in jazz, nobody really knew how to play Brazilian grooves properly until people like Marcos came to IU in the early 90s and started, and the classical and popular styles. See, in Brazil, South America, there was never such a big distinction between popular and classical music. And I still think there shouldn't be. I think it's it's a sad shame that there's so much disparity in the way we've traditionally in this country thought about a wall between this is classical music and this is popular music. In Brazil, those distinctions were scarcely noticeable. Villalobos wrote Suite Popular. It was a guitar suite playing choro, the street folk music of Rio de Janeiro. You know, Choros number one. You know, he wrote choro music. That's like somebody writing a Dixieland piece for classical guitar when the Dixieland thing was really happening. And so, you know, lately, a lot of guitarists like myself of my generation, people who are now in their 50s, started realizing that, you know, this whole distinction of classical versus, we were at an awkward crossroads, but we started realizing the silliness of these divisions and how much richer music is when you incorporate it all. In fact, Maurice Ravel, this is not related to the guitar directly, but Ravel, the great French Impressionist composer, was a big fan of jazz in the 20s. Huge fan of Gershwin, quotes him in his second movement of his sonata for piano and violin, 1928, and also big fan of Ellington. And he admonished a bunch of musicologists out at the University of Texas at Austin back in the 30s, saying, why are you ignoring your most important musical resource in this country, the blues and jazz? Ravel couldn't believe these musicologists over here were ignoring it.
Yeah.
So I don't ignore it. My friend Marcos, my Brazilian friend who taught us, he was a great classical player too. Taught me how to play Brazilian grooves. And I played in his choro band, and the same style of band that Villalobos played in 1900s, in the 1910s. So it was awakening. That's one of the great things about universities, and why I hope music schools stay strong. When you get the best of all worlds when you get people from Brazil studying with, you know, in class together with people from the Midwest United States, you know, maybe some people from the Southwest, LA, Arizona, we had people from Spain and Norway, all over the place. When you get people from different backgrounds playing, and Taiwan, you know, when you get people blending, like you were saying, you know, like when styles blend together, I think it's so important. It's very important to this world in many, many ways and many levels.
We're good.
Yeah.